Ever wonder how the Vietnam War directly impacted the United States and shaped our place in the world? This wasn't just some faraway conflict, but a war that left deep scars on our nation, affecting families, soldiers, and the very way we look at wars today. Here on American War, we're diving into a frank and powerful analysis of this battle that tested American strength and values. In this video, you'll understand how political decisions in Washington, military strategies on the battlefield, and the cultural impact of the war transformed America forever. More than just history, it's a chance to reflect on who we are as a country and the lessons we still carry. So tell me, have you ever wondered how this war changed the course of our society, our families, and even the way we view freedom? If so, you're in the right place. Stick with me and discover the answers few dare to explore. The Vietnam War was much more than an armed conflict. It was a turning point that shaped international relations during the Cold War. Initially, it was a legitimate fight for Vietnamese independence against colonial forces, but it quickly became an ideological battleground between major world powers. It was in this scenario that complex and often controversial war strategies came into play. Ever wonder how seemingly small decisions in military strategy can trigger such devastating impacts? This conflict left deep marks on both Vietnam and other nations involved. With over 2 million civilian deaths, the war revealed just how high the price of independence and ideological disputes could be. On the other hand, it also showed the world the resilience of a people determined to achieve freedom. It's as if each strategic choice reflected the struggle between the desire for autonomy and the external pressures seeking to control the country's future. America's war in Vietnam highlighted the complexities of modern warfare, where political, cultural, and military factors are inextricably intertwined. While the forces involved clashed on the battlefield, decisions made in political meeting rooms had equally devastating consequences. Interestingly, even in the shadows of destruction, stories of courage and resilience emerge, setting the stage for us to understand the events that led to the escalation of the conflict. The Vietnam War, seen as one of the most devastating conflicts of the 20th century, began as a struggle for independence but quickly became intertwined with the tensions of the Cold War. On one side, Vietnam sought to liberate itself from colonial rule, and on the other, major world powers saw the country as a strategic stage for their ideological disputes. This conflict, which began as a legitimate quest for sovereignty, became an emblematic example of how war strategies can transform local causes into global battles. Throughout the conflict, the death toll was alarming. Over 2 million civilians lost their lives, not to mention the military losses on both sides. But numbers alone can't capture the true devastation caused by this American war. Entire villages were destroyed, rainforests burned, and families separated by relentless bombings. It was as if Vietnam itself was a chessboard where foreign powers played, without considering the consequences for the local inhabitants. Behind all the chaos, the struggle for independence was still the beating heart of this conflict. However, the intervention of external forces such as the United States introduced layers of political and military complexity that exacerbated the situation. This period was marked by increasingly sophisticated and brutal war strategies, from massive aerial bombardments to the use of chemical weapons. This dynamic shaped the scenario we'll discuss next, the historical roots that led to the war. Vietnam's history is marked by a continuous struggle against colonization, a battle that began with the French invasion in 1858. For nearly a century, the Vietnamese faced economic exploitation, cultural repression, and political oppression at the hands of the colonizers. Resistance, however, never ceased. Local leaders, like the Mandarins loyal to the people, fomented revolts, and the spirit of independence remained alive in each generation, like a flame that never goes out. This scenario changed drastically with the arrival of Ho Chi Minh, a revolutionary leader who, with strategic vision, began to unite the people around a common goal: the total independence of Vietnam. Inspired by Marxist and anti-colonial ideals, he laid the foundations of a movement that combined armed resistance and diplomatic strategies. Imagine a leader who, in addition to commanding battles, wrote letters to allied nations, trying to secure international support for the cause. This type of multifaceted strategy is a fascinating example of how politics and war can go hand in hand. The Japanese occupation during World War II added another layer to this historical struggle. When the Japanese were defeated, the Vietnamese expected freedom, but faced an unwelcome return. The French, determined to re-establish their control. This only intensified the desire for independence, planting the seeds for a much larger conflict. And it's exactly at this moment that we begin to realize how war and political strategies can combine to alter the destiny of a nation. French colonization in Vietnam left deep marks on the country, both in the economy and in the culture. During French rule, the Vietnamese population suffered severe exploitation, with the country's land and resources being expropriated to benefit the mother country. Resistance, however, began early. The creation of nationalist movements, such as the Viet Minh, showed that the Vietnamese were willing to fight for their freedom. This determination, which defied the logic of the colonial powers, set the stage for a long and arduous struggle. After World War II, the scenario became even more complex. With the defeat of the Japanese, who had occupied Vietnam during the conflict, many believed that independence would finally arrive. However, the French, with the support of the US, returned to reaffirm their control over the territory. This generated a new wave of revolts, led by Ho Chi Minh. From this point on, the Vietnamese resistance began to use tactics that would be striking in the American war: ambushes, guerrillas, and taking advantage of the hostile terrain as a strategic advantage. This initial phase of the struggle also highlighted the central role of leadership and morale in war strategies. Ho Chi Minh, for example, knew that he could not defeat the French by brute force, but understood the value of keeping the people united around a common goal. He wrote, "Nothing is more precious than independence and freedom." This phrase became a mantra for the Vietnamese people, and a universal lesson on how war goes beyond weapons. It is, above all, a battle of ideas. In 1945, Ho Chi Minh took a bold step by declaring Vietnam's independence. Inspired by anti-colonial ideals and the promises of self-determination made by the Allies in World War II, he announced to the world that Vietnam would no longer bow to foreign powers. The Declaration of Independence, curiously, echoed passages from the United States Declaration of Independence in a strategic attempt to win Western support. However, instead of support, the country faced the French resumption, which was determined to maintain colonial control. The Vietnamese resistance, led by Ho Chi Minh, was not limited to the use of military force. It involved a well-thought-out political and diplomatic strategy. The Vietnamese, at a technological disadvantage, compensated for this gap with tactical intelligence. Through the use of guerrillas and a deep understanding of the local terrain, they managed to inflict significant defeats on the French, culminating in the emblematic victory of Dien Bien Phu. This battle became a milestone in the history of war strategies, showing that even a superior power can be defeated when facing a determined and strategic opponent. The United States' involvement at this time was decisive for the escalation of the conflict. The Truman Doctrine, based on the containment of communism, led the American government to support the French, fearing that a Vietnamese victory could trigger the domino effect in the region. This initial support marked the beginning of American involvement, a prelude to the war that was to come. However, each U.S. action seemed to reinforce the Vietnamese determination to fight to the end. This growing tension leads us to the division of the country and the beginning of a new stage of the conflict. In 1954, after the French defeat at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the Geneva Accords divided Vietnam in two. In the north, Ho Chi Minh established a communist government with support from the Soviet Union and China. In the south, an anti-communist regime was formed, led by Ngo Dinh Diem, with direct support from the United States. This division, made under the pretext of a future unification through elections, ended up intensifying tensions. It's curious how, in trying to avoid larger conflicts, political decisions often end up fueling the flames of war. While South Vietnam faced political instability and popular dissatisfaction, North Vietnam consolidated its position with strong ideological propaganda and foreign military support. It was during this period that the Viet Cong, a communist guerrilla force in the South, began to gain prominence. The American doctrine of containment of communism led the U.S. to expand its involvement, initially providing financial aid and military training. This support, which seemed strategic, would become a much more costly commitment in the following decades. The escalation of the conflict was inevitable. The Viet Cong attacks, allied with Ho Chi Minh's unification ambitions, placed the United States in an uncomfortable position. To contain the communist advance, the U.S. began sending troops and intensified its support for the government of the South. The famous domino theory guided American decisions. fearing that if Vietnam fell, other Southeast Asian countries would follow the same path. It was like watching a chess game where each move seemed to lead closer to checkmate, but never to peace. The official entry of the United States into the Vietnam War marked the beginning of a conflict of epic proportions. In 1965, with Operation Rolling Thunder, the U.S. began a massive bombing campaign against North Vietnam. The idea was to undermine the military capabilities of the North Vietnamese and pressure them to give up their offensive. However, reality showed another face. Instead of weakening the enemy, the bombings only increased North Vietnam's determination. War strategies based on brute force, like this one, often ignore the resilience of a people in defense of their homeland. On the ground, the challenges faced by American troops were immense. The dense jungles and swampy terrain favored the guerrilla tactics employed by the Viet Cong. Improvised traps, underground tunnels, and constant ambushes turned Vietnam into an unpredictable battlefield. American soldiers, although well-equipped, often fought against an invisible enemy. The use of chemical weapons such as Agent Orange and napalm further exacerbated the suffering, destroying entire ecosystems and leaving deep scars on the local population and the combatants themselves. In 1968, the Tet Offensive completely challenged the American perception of control of the conflict. The attack, coordinated by the Viet Cong, hit dozens of important targets, including the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Although the Americans quickly regained ground, the offensive demonstrated that the Communists had unexpected coordination and strength capabilities. The impact was devastating for public morale in the United States, with growing protests against the war. From that point on, it became clear that the American victory, so announced, would be more difficult to achieve than imagined. With growing political and social pressure in the United States, the Richard Nixon administration initiated the so-called Vietnamization. This plan consisted of transferring military responsibility to South Vietnamese troops, while American forces began to withdraw. Between 1969 and 1973, U.S. troops were significantly reduced, but the conflict on the ground remained intense. The idea was to create a self-sufficient South Vietnamese force, but reality showed that, without the direct support of the Americans, the Southern regime was vulnerable. In 1973, after intense negotiations in Paris, the last American troops left Vietnam. However, the war was far from over for the Vietnamese. In 1975, North Vietnam launched a decisive offensive, capturing Saigon and definitively ending the conflict. This victory was not only military, but also symbolic, unifying the country under a communist regime. The event marked the end of one of the most polarizing wars in modern history and the defeat of a world superpower. The consequences were profound and lasting. Millions of lives were lost, entire cities devastated, and Vietnam faced a long road to reconstruction. For the United States, the American war in Vietnam left cultural and political scars, influencing public perception of future military interventions. For the Vietnamese people, it was the beginning of a new chapter, full of economic and social challenges. It is impossible to look at this conflict without reflecting on the lessons left behind, both in terms of war strategy and human impact. So, what did you learn from the Vietnam War? How can political decisions, war strategies, and the resilience of a people be applied to the challenges we face today? Think about it. If even a superpower like the United States was tested to the limit, what can this story teach us about how to deal with our own battles, whether personal or professional? The history of American wars is full of lessons that have shaped not only our country, but the world. And if you're left wanting to know more, I challenge you. Why not explore these stories in more depth? Leave in the comments what intrigued you the most, or what you'd like to understand better. Your insight could be the start of a conversation that enriches everyone. Before you go, don't forget, subscribe to American War and hit the bell to be notified about our upcoming videos. We have so many more incredible stories and powerful lessons that you won't want to miss. See you in the next video.